wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. May the peace, the love, and blessings of Allah be with you. Welcome to the last few days of Ramadan. Welcome to Ramadan Transformation. And today we're going to talk about, as we come towards the end of Ramadan, we're going to be talking about how you can have a guilt-free Ramadan. How to have a guilt-free Ramadan. Now you might be thinking, Mamoon, why are you teaching us this towards the end of Ramadan? Why didn't you start at the beginning of Ramadan with this? Well, because I wanted you to experience what it's like to have a Ramadan that isn't perfect. Because my guess is, if you're a normal human being, you've probably had a less than perfect Ramadan. Maybe there's been times where you didn't go to the mosque for Taraweeh. Maybe there was times where it took a while for the Ramadan to get started and for you to get into the spirit. And now that Ramadan's escaping, maybe you're like really holding on to it, like, oh my gosh, I hope I find Laylatul Qadr so Allah can forgive me for all of the prayers I've missed and stuff like that. Well, the reason we want to be talking about a guilt-free Ramadan, in order to have a guilt-free Ramadan, it's not about, okay, if I want a guilt-free Ramadan, I have to do everything perfectly during the month, and then I can have a guilt-free Ramadan. Guilt should not be the purpose for which you do things during Ramadan. In order to have a guilt-free Ramadan and a guilt-free rest of your life, you need to understand a thing or two about the feeling of guilt. See, now this comes over into my territory, the feeling of guilt. So the best way for me to explain this, not only how to have a guilt-free Ramadan, but also have a guilt-free rest of your life, the best way to explain this is by telling you a quick story. So recently I was talking to one of my clients, and she was feeling really guilty about something. She came to me and she said, look, I've got this problem. I'm feeling kind of guilty. Can you help me out? And I was like, sure, tell me what's going on. And she was like, well, I have this friend, and my friend asked me to do a favor to her, and I couldn't. I didn't want to. I didn't really have the capacity to do it, so I said no. And I was like, okay. And she's like, and I have the right to say no, and I don't have to say yes. If somebody asks you a favor, it's up to you whether you say yes or no, right? And I was like, yeah, sure. The more you say no, the more successful you become. If you want to, let me tell you something. If you want to memorize this book, and I tell you as somebody who wants to do that myself, if you want to memorize this book, I can absolutely guarantee you're going to say no to people a lot. Why? Because memorizing this book takes several hours a day, several hours during which other people might want you to do things that aren't your obligation, and you're going to have to learn to say no. So I said, of course it's okay to say no. She's like, okay, but I feel really guilty about it. And I was like, okay, well, let's explore that for a moment. And I asked her this question, which is a question which really is, it's a really important question. I asked her one question, and I said, okay, your friend wants you to do a favor. You said no, and now you're feeling guilty. What do you think the feeling of guilt is telling you? What does this guilt tell you? What does this guilty feeling actually tell you? She was like, yeah, that's a really good question. She's like, well, I guess the feeling of guilt is telling me I have some kind of obligation to my friend. I was like, okay, what else is the feeling of guilt telling you? She's like, well, feeling of guilt tells me that maybe I'm being arrogant. Maybe I'm looking down on my friend by not doing her this favor. And, maybe I'm not seeing her as an equal. Maybe I'm being arrogant. I was like, okay, what else does the feeling of guilt tell you? She said, the feeling of guilt is telling me, I don't want her to have haqq over me on the day of judgment. I don't want her to have any rights over me on the day of judgment. So I'm feeling this guilt, and it's telling me about that. And I was like, okay. Very reasonable. The feeling of guilt is telling me I have an obligation towards her. The feeling of guilt is telling me I might be being arrogant. The feeling of guilt is telling me I don't want her, my friend, to have a haqq over me on the day of judgment. Okay. Very reasonable. But here's the thing. Remember how we started this whole series and I said that there's an outside-in illusion and there's the inside-out reality? The outside-in illusion is that feeling comes from something other than thought, and the inside-out reality is that feeling just comes from thought. So let's explore this a little bit in terms of the feeling of guilt. See, because what I said to her, after she told me what her feeling of guilt was telling her, I told her some things that really changed her perspective on life and a lot of things. So look at this. From the outside in perspective, which is where most of humanity is most of the time, we say, I feel guilty because I did something wrong. I did something wrong. We say, I feel guilty because I'm bad. I feel guilty because of the state of my affairs. Like, I did bad things, I did wrong things, and so now I feel guilty. Right? It's very reasonable. It just so happens to be absolutely false. Because the outside in, the idea that feeling comes from somewhere other than thought, like feeling comes from the fact that you did something wrong, or feeling comes from the idea that you're bad, or feeling comes from your affairs. Your feeling of guilt doesn't come from the state of your affairs. Your feeling of guilt comes from the state of mind, from your state of mind. So I told her, what does the feeling of guilt tell you? And she said, the feeling of guilt tells me I have an obligation towards her. I might be being arrogant, and I don't want my friend to have a huck over me on the day of judgment. And I said, no, that's not what the feeling of guilt is telling you. Your feeling of guilt doesn't know anything about your obligations. Your feeling of guilt doesn't even know you have obligations. Your feeling of guilt doesn't know what an obligation is. It doesn't know what arrogance is. Your feeling of guilt has no idea how Allah is going to treat you on the day of judgment. There's things that guilt can do, and there's things that it can't do. What guilt can't do is tell you about the state of your affairs. What guilt can do is tell you about your state of mind in this moment. From an inside-out perspective, the only cause of guilty feelings is guilty thought. The only thing a feeling of guilt is telling you is, I've got guilty thinking right now. I've got guilty thinking right now. That's it. I often say to people, a feeling of guilt, if it's telling you anything, it's only telling you that you've forgotten how loving and forgiving Allah is. If you remembered even for a moment how loving and forgiving Allah is, you wouldn't feel guilty. You would just stop sinning. Right? So here's another thing from looking at it from an inside-out paradigm, knowing that guilty feeling just comes from guilty thought. Here's another big thing. Your feelings, I said to my client, your feelings don't even know you have a friend, let alone do they know how you should be interacting with your friend. Your feeling of guilt doesn't even know you have a friend. Guilty feeling just comes from guilty thought. It's a total internal thing, right? Now, when you have strong feelings, whether it's guilt or anger or sadness or anything, those feelings are simply telling you you're not seeing things clearly. That's the only thing your feelings are telling you. You're not seeing things clearly. It's looking to you as though the outside world is causing your feelings. It's looking to you as though how you're treating your friend is what's causing your feelings. But it's not. And let me prove this point even further, because I know a lot of Muslims and a lot of people have the idea that if I sin, then I'll feel guilty. And if I don't sin, then I'll feel good, right? It's very logical from the outside in illusion. The reality, let's strip away the illusion. The reality is it doesn't work that way. Is it possible for you to sin and feel absolutely no guilt? Yeah, people do it every day. People do it every single day. Is it possible for you to not do anything wrong and then feel really, really guilty? Yeah. I have clients who would feel really unbelievably guilty because they didn't pray nafil after their sunnah prayer. Nafil after sunnah. It's not a sin. Why are you feeling guilty about something that's not even a sin? The feeling of guilt doesn't tell you anything about the state of your affairs. It's only telling you about the state of your mind. So if you want to have a guilt-free Ramadan, the idea isn't to create this illusion of the perfect you and then try and live up to it, which you'll never be able to do, and then not live up to it and then feel really guilty and then blame Ramadan for your feeling of guilt. Your feeling of guilt isn't coming from how you did Ramadan. Your feeling of guilt is coming from your state of mind. If you want transformation this Ramadan, you need to see this really clearly. Your feelings come from inside of you, not from outside of you. They come from thought in the moment, not from anywhere else. And that's a really important distinction, because now All of a sudden, if guilt comes from inside of you, you've never had a guilty Ramadan. Because Ramadan can't cause guilt. Not doing enough during Ramadan doesn't cause guilt. Doing enough during Ramadan doesn't mean you won't feel guilty. Guilt itself has nothing to do with Ramadan. It has nothing to do with how much you sin or don't sin. It only has to do with your state of mind in the moment. You can live in your thoughts are a prison, and you can encage yourself in a prison called the prison of guilt, and you can live there your whole life, irrespective of how much good or bad you do. Or you can live in a prison of sadness. In your whole life, you can be sad, irrespective of the circumstances of your life. Or you can live in a prison, a thought-made prison of delight. Have a happy prison, right? You could live in a prison of joy and abundance. And when that becomes your prison, all of a sudden it becomes wider and wider until it fills the whole earth and more. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم. May the peace, love, and blessings of Allah be with you. And the final thing I will say is, don't make more effort during these last days of Ramadan because you're afraid you'll feel guilty. Make more effort during these last few days of Ramadan because they're so precious. The Quran doesn't tell you that guilt is the criteria between right and wrong. The Quran has its own criteria between right and wrong, regardless of how you feel about it. Whether you love it or hate it, whether you feel super happy or super guilty about it, the last few days of Ramadan, especially the last few nights, are the most precious of the year. One of these nights is Laylatul Qadr, which means it's a time where anything you pray for is accepted. Allah will forgive all of your previous sins. Every action is worth 1,000 months, which is a lifetime's worth of action. So make an effort towards Allah, not because you might feel guilty if you don't, but make an effort towards Allah because you love Allah, and because how can you be anything other than grateful when you get to experience life like this? أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم. May the peace, love, and blessings of Allah be with you.